With us now via Skype is Robin Wright, author of several books, including Rock the Casbah, Rage and Rebellion Across the Islamic World. Wright is also a scholar on Libya and journalist who has reported from the Middle East for many years. Robin, thank you so much for joining us. I think it bears noting, and everybody really knows, we've already had an exhaustive hearing conducted by an independent panel on what happened during this attack in Benghazi. So the hearing that we're having now, headed by Darrell Issa, can this be characterized as anything other than political?
Well, it comes across as very political. This is the great tragedy of Chris Stevens' life and of what happened in Benghazi, that it's less about what lessons do you learn, how you can prevent this from happening again, and more about recriminations by one party against another. And that's Chris would have been very saddened by this sequence of developments.
I can only imagine. Of course, the first panel concluded that there should have been better security there. There's an assertion during this hearing that perhaps military action would have changed the outcome, and that's certainly debatable. But what did you learn? Did you learn some new things from the testimony yesterday?
We learned some poignant details of those last minutes in Chris's life when he tried to get a hold of Greg Hicks, who did not pick up his phone twice because he was watching a favorite television program. And when he finally did call the number back, Chris said, "We're under attack." That's one of the human errors that happens in these kinds of things, and it's inexcusable, but it happens. The thing we learned from the very beginning was that there may have been some incompetence, but this is not the kind of scandal that the committee chairman is trying to make it out to be. There was not an intentional cover-up. There is something called the fog of war, and there's also something called the fog of terrorism. And it takes a very long time to figure out the details. And a lot of people forget that the American embassies in neighboring Tunisia and in neighboring Egypt had both come under attack because of a controversial video by a man who at the time lived in the United States. And it was in that climate, there were a lot of questions about whether the mission in Benghazi was part of that wave of attacks on the anniversary of 9/11 in that week, or was it something different? And it was really hard to sort out. After all, I lived in Beirut during the very first suicide bombings of 2 American embassies in the Marine compound, and it takes a long time, a lot of investigation, incredible forensics to try to figure out who's responsible, what happened. And unlike the marathon bombing in Boston, we did have the kind of intelligence assets in terms of cameras at every post to figure out who was responsible, what were their motives. And so it's not surprising that Susan Rice, in getting on the shows, did not have all the details of exactly what happened. Did she misspeak? Absolutely. Were there mistakes made? Absolutely. But the tragedy is that this is really become a political football rather than an attempt to figure out how do you prevent this from happening again.
Robin, when it comes to Hicks' testimony, what is more important? Is it the perception of his questions about the incident, or actually what occurred on the ground in the moments of the attack itself?
Well, politics is always about perception, isn't it? So one of the lingering impacts of this testimony will be the perception. There may be more focus on the aftermath and who was allowed in what rooms at what time to ask what questions, rather than on what actually happened in those pivotal final hours. It's pretty clear that the United States made a strategic decision not to deploy the military, in part, they claim, because it would take too long to get American air warplanes to Benghazi. There's a 600-mile distance between Tripoli and Benghazi. The very limited special forces team they had in Tripoli would have taken a while to get there, and they also had to protect the embassy in Tripoli. So there were a lot of things, a lot of moving pieces happening very quickly. And American embassies, unfortunately, are vulnerable unless they become fortresses, which increasingly they are. Benghazi was not yet a fortress, and so it was vulnerable.
Robin Wright, this is Edward Wyckoff-Williams. In the hearings yesterday, has there been any talk about whether or not former CIA Director David Petraeus is going to be called? Because I think that we have been told now that there was a CIA operation underway at the time. And that was a part of why there was very limited information that Susan Rice even was privy to herself. Where does it stand with respect to whether David Petraeus is ever going to be called to question or answer?
Oh, there have been a lot of indications that he might be. I don't know the details of what the schedule is. There was a CIA station in Benghazi, not far from where the mission was, and it had a number of personnel, many of whom were evacuated as well. So the connection, we don't know a lot of the details because they're classified, of what was going on exactly at that moment with the CIA station. Whether it did enough, whether it knew enough. There were clear indications that American intelligence knew at that point that al-Qaeda cells were making a comeback in Libya, and that's one reason that there's every indication there was a lot of incompetence in providing enough security. But one of the tragedies of all of this, it's also the Republicans who've put the greatest pressure on the administration to cut back, including on its foreign policy budget or foreign affairs budget. So, you can't do everything with the resources you have. And Chris Stevens and the 3 other Americans who died were victims in part of that.
It's interesting how Ambassador Stevens even became targeted, or perhaps became targeted. Talk a little bit about that, Robin.
Well, this is a man who spent 3 tours of duty in Libya, and he was an extraordinary diplomat, one of America's finest, one of the up-and-coming young faces of American diplomacy, a good friend of mine for 25 years. And he was a man who knew both the streets and the elites. And he'd spent a year in Benghazi during his second tour, during the uprising against Muammar Gaddafi, when he operated out of a hotel room with a limited staff, was highly vulnerable to attack or any action by the Gaddafi regime in trying to intimidate the United States. And he saw it out. And this was I believe, his first trip back to Benghazi since his return as ambassador. And it may well have been a place that he actually felt a little bit safer than he did in Tripoli. Unfortunately, we'll never know. But the fact is, he knew Benghazi very well and was widely loved in Benghazi.
And very briefly in the last couple of seconds, what do you think will be the outcome of these hearings? Will this blow back on the Republicans, or will it open up a controversy that perhaps they seek to open up?
I think it's polarized people, that there will be some blowback among Democrats who are angry at the Republicans for politicizing this, but I also think there will be blowback against the Democrats and potentially even Hillary Clinton's potential to become the leading Democratic candidate in 2016, that she will be held accountable for a lot of decisions that were made in a lot of other departments, but she ultimately was the Secretary of State.
Indeed. Robin Wright, thank you so much for your time and perspective.
Thank you.